Okay, hi, grade 8. I'm going to do a lesson today on the nervous system. So your nervous system pages in your textbook are page 146 to page 151. So that is what you're responsible for today. You got some check and reflect questions on page 151, numbers 1 through 6. That will be useful for you as well. Okay. So where I want to start here is the basic unit of the nervous system, and that's the neuron. All right. So the neuron, the nervous system is made almost exclusively of nervous tissue called neurons, and neurons are the nervous system cells. So your nervous system is composed of your sensory receptors. All right, so we've talked about things like sight, touch, smell, and the like, and different types of receptors that are inside your body as well. Brain, spinal cord, and your nerves. You should know about the nervous system that it runs on an electrical circuit. So messages sent through the nervous system are sent as electrical impulses, and these impulses get sent through the actual nervous system cells, the neurons. Okay. Impulses that send messages originate from various parts of the bodies detecting stimuluses, and these impulses are sent to the brain or spinal cord, and then your brain or spinal cord organizes an appropriate response, and that responding message is sent back to the correct tissue. Okay? So neurons receive messages from small branches of the body. They receive messages through parts of their cells called dendrites, and they send messages away from their cells through a part of their structure called an axon. So just to show you this, all right. So the neuron itself, it kind of looks like a little squid. There's trillions of them in your nerves. Okay, cells. Detection of stimuluses come in through the dendrites, these little tentacles. The signal comes into the nucleus, and then it's decoded in the nucleus of a neuron, and then it's sent to other neurons down its tail. This is called the axon. All right, so stimulus comes in through the dendrites, through the cell body, and then out the axon to other neurons to be decoded by other neurons. All right. There's all sorts of, so you should know dendrites and axon and the direction of transmission. So if I look at a nervous system cell and I draw it, right, and this is a neuron. Okay, the stimuluses come in through the tentacles or the dendrites and then through the axon and then to other neurons. And that's how a nerve stimulus moves through, very simplistic, we'll talk about this more in high school sciences, but very simplistically, this is how a nerve transmission moves through your cells, or your nervous system cells, okay? This would be, your nucleus and the cytoplasm of the cell itself, the cell body. Okay, the nervous system works on stimulus and response networks. So your body is constantly taking in stimuluses from the environment, all right, be that things that you see or things that you hear or things that you smell, or internally things that your body needs to respond to, like digestion. You're constantly interpreting stimuluses, and we've talked about this. We talked about this in the previous part of the unit, looking at adaptation and things that you're responding to all the time. So your sensory receptors, the purpose of your sensory receptors is to detect stimuluses. Okay, so that's the purpose of all of your sensory receptors. The purpose of your brain and spinal cord is to coordinate responses. Right, so those stimuluses get sent to your central nervous system, which is your brain and spinal cord, and the brain and spinal cord decode that information and then send a signal back to your body to coordinate appropriate responses. So whether that be to move away from a threat or maybe dilate or constrict your pupils if the amount of light in a room or in an area changes, or maybe you smell something like fire, and then the correct response is to move away from that area. Or if a stimulus is coming back to your brain and spinal cord about the types of food that you're digesting right now, it'll coordinate appropriate responses to help release the right enzymes. So some of this is under conscious control, some of it is not under conscious control, right? So your central nervous system works on a stimulus response system, and your sensory receptors are detecting stimuluses, and then the central nervous system's purpose is to decode those stimuluses and coordinate appropriate responses. Okay, and we do that through the transmission of electrical signal through the neurons. The neurons themselves will create nerve tissue. So how is the nervous system organized? Like I said, you have the central nervous system, all right, which is your main coordinator of the nervous system itself, and then you have all of your peripheral nerves. And the deal with the peripheral nerves, everything in green here, is they're a relay center between the central nervous system and the rest of the body. So there's signals coming into the central nervous system from your peripheral nerves, and then the central nervous system is sending out responses, all right, through the peripheral nerves to your extremities, right? So this human nervous system is the most complex nervous system in the entire animal kingdom because of the amount of peripheral nerves that we have and the complexity of our central nervous system, more specifically the brain. So the green neurons there are the peripheral nervous system. So you need to know this. So the peripheral nervous system detects stimuli. It relays info to the CNS, which is the central nervous system. And then it also receives info from the CNS to organize responses. You have two types of neurons in your peripheral nervous system. You have sensory neurons, which sense things in the environment. So they carry information from the body to the CNS about what's going on. And then motor neurons take the response that's coordinated from the central nervous system and brings it to your organs or to your body in order to act accordingly based on what information the central nervous system is receiving. So this shows you something that I've kind of pulled from Bio 30 notes a little bit, but this is a sensory motor neuron pathway. So this is a pin in the skin, and you can see where the arrows are. This is the spinal cord, okay? So this would be a sensation of pain. This would be detected by pain receptors or nociceptors in the skin. The stimulus would get sent into the central nervous system via a relay nerve. So this would be a sensory nerve. The central nervous system in the spinal cord would determine what would happen to it. Okay, so there is nervous system tissue inside the spinal cord. The spinal cord is kind of like the first interpreter, all right? So it's the first decoder. It determines whether or not a reflex response is necessary. So with reflexes, our brain doesn't actually receive the information. The response is carried out before the brain transmits the information, and that's dependent on the intensity of the stimulus. So let's say this pin in the skin is there, but it's not super strong, right? It's not something that's really, really painful. There might not need to be a reflex response. So if this is not an intense stimulus or not an intense enough stimulus, then the spinal cord will interpret that, and then the brain can process what to do, all right? Think about an acupuncture needle, for example. You know, an acupuncture needle goes into your skin, but it doesn't necessarily hurt, so I don't need to withdraw my limb from that. But let's say this was a nail, or a screw when I'm, working on some sort of wood, maybe I'm doing some home renovations, and that's unexpected and it's very, very painful. So that would bring a very, very intense stimulus to the spinal cord. The intensity of that stimulus, so the amount of electrical signals coming here, would elicit a reflex response. So the brain actually wouldn't process this. There would be a response just from the spinal cord, and I would remove myself from the situation, or remove my limb from the situation, or try to get this nail out as quickly as possible. All right? So the spinal cord determines whether reflexes are appropriate or not, and the spinal cord determines that based on the intensity of the stimulus. And that's individualistic because everyone has different types of pain thresholds, right? So we can learn how to control pain through exposure to it, for example. So stimulus comes in through the sensory neuron, central nervous system decodes it, and then the response goes to the appropriate part of the body. So in this case, if we have a pin in the skin, then or a nail or an acupuncture needle or something like that, the motor neurons or the muscle fibers, right? The motor neurons would send a response to the muscle fibers because that's the appropriate tissue that would respond to this, right? So, I would move my limbs in order to take the pin out, or I'd move away from the painful stimulus, or something like that, right? So sensory neuron incoming, motor neuron outgoing response from the central nervous system. So you should understand that. Okay, so the peripheral nervous system can not only be divided into sensory and motor neurons, but we can break the peripheral nervous system into somatic and autonomic nerves as well. So somatic peripheral nerves are things that are under our conscious control, and autonomic nerves are sensory and motor nerves of the peripheral nervous system that we don't actually directly control. So there's lots of things going on in our body that we don't actually have conscious control of, and that's a good thing. I don't have to think about my heartbeat, for example. It just makes that change itself, right? So the heart regulates itself. The nervous system helps control that. So we have autonomic stimulus response nerves that deal with that. I don't necessarily have to worry about breathing. I don't have to worry about digesting my food. I don't have to worry about moving pieces of undigested food through my digestive tract, for example. I don't need to worry about recruiting immune system cells to deal with pathogens that come into my body. And so all those different types of things. So there's a lot of things that we don't have under conscious control. Moderating our body temperature is another one. Right, so somatic, soma means body. Excuse me. So somatic peripheral nerves relay responses to stimuli you have conscious control over. So we control things like our muscular system, and whether we choose to move our body or not, right? So if a question is asked in class for something, you have conscious control over whether or not you want to ask it. You'd have to raise your hand to do that, right? Autonomic peripheral nerves are not under conscious control. They relay information to body parts that need to function without you thinking about it, right? Heart rate, pupillar constriction or dilation, digestion, right? I talked about breathing rate and other types of things, all right? This is good that we don't have to deal with this, that your body can kind of work on autopilot for a lot of the day. Because if we had to think about all of these things, like how many times does my heart need to beat a minute, for example, all of these we wouldn't be able to focus on anything else. Your day would literally be full of just trying to maintain normal metabolic living. Okay, so with the somatic nervous system, right, you have a sensory input. It's integrated into the central nervous system through the brain and spinal cord, and then the response is carried out. Okay? So we have control over that. These are all the things. Now, you don't need to memorize this, but this just shows you all the things that are under autonomic control. So you can see different organs. So this is a salivary gland. This is the eye. This are lungs and breathing rate. This is heartbeat. This is the liver. Okay, these are kidneys, so kidney filtration. The stomach itself, when it starts to take in food, it'll contract and release gastric juice. We don't have to think about doing that. This is the pancreas. This releases insulin to help monitor blood glucose. right? I don't have to think about the pancreas doing that. I don't have to say, like, when I eat candy or like pancreas release insulin now, right? That's really good that I don't have to do that. It just responds when sugar ends up in the gut. Small intestine and large intestine. So you can see all of these things are under autonomic control. This is a really useful slide for you to look at for grade 8, but also for future reference when we talk about the nervous system in Bio 30 and Bio 20. We sort of have control over expulsion of wastes. So, we can control, whether or not we, go to the bathroom, which is a good thing, right? I don't want to, I don't want to, leave like brown chocolate bars in my pants whenever I need to. I have to hold that sometimes, right? And the bladder too, we have control over, right? I don't want to be, urinating in my own pants whenever my bladder gets full, right? So we can control and hold that to an extent, right? Once the bladder reaches a certain critical amount, then we lose control over that, right? So that's why, it's important not to, hold it in as long as possible, right? So, if you're on a road trip and your parents don't want to stop, then, you've got to negotiate that a little bit, right? And the rectum here, this is where fecal matter is housed, so we can control that to an extent, right? So if the small intestine starts to get backed up too much, then it will the sphincters and the smooth muscle contractions we will lose control of. All right, so these are autonomic responses. So these are unconscious control of our nervous of our different body systems, and these are fed by peripheral nerves and controlled by the central nervous system as well. All right, so the central nervous system has four main parts: the spinal cord, the cerebrum, which is the main part of the brain that gives us personality and logic and reasoning and complex thought; the cerebellum, which is responsible for fine motor control. So when I master skills like riding a bike, for example, it helps me. It stores that information in that part of the brain, in the cerebellum. The medulla controls hormones and fight or flight reactions. So the medulla largely controls autonomic responses or involuntary responses. So the central nervous system receives stimuli from sensory organs via the peripheral nervous system, and also receives stimuli internally, right? So there's lots of things that we're responding to inside the body all the time. The central nervous system assesses stimuli and coordinates responses. So the stimulus comes to the central nervous system by the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system decodes it and then determines a response. And that's largely based on the individual, right? Like, everyone has their own personal experiences and their own unique perspectives. So your experiences will determine how you respond to different stimuluses, right? So the message from main organizing centers in the brain are sent to the spinal cord, which transmits responses back to the peripheral nervous system and subsequent body systems, all right? So the peripheral nervous system sends stimuluses in to the central nervous system and then shuttles them away to coordinate proper responses. So page 148 in your textbook gives you this little table here, figure 3.33, shows you different parts of the brain that control these different senses. Okay, so that would be a useful thing to take a look at. Page 149 also looks at the reflex response, and I've already put that on this lecture, so you should take a look at that as well. Right, so there's no brain processing with reflex responses, okay? It's done right in the spinal cord, in the gray matter in the spinal cord. So that's what this shows right here. You have this relay nerve in between the sensory nerve and the motor nerve. This is called an interneuron. And if a stimulus is really, really intense, then the interneuron will kind of override sending the stimulus to the brain to coordinate a quicker response. So if it doesn't have to go to the brain, it can just come from the spinal cord and write back to the effector, which would be the organ or the part of the body that needs to respond to the stimulus, that can happen a lot faster. All right, so the spinal cord contains interneurons, which connect sensory neurons to motor neurons, and this is important for reflexes. So the interneuron does that initial interpretation to determine if reflex is necessary or not, and that'll be determined by what we consider threatening, all right? So and that's determined by the amount of nerves that are recruited here. So if I put my hand on a hot element on the stove, that's a very large stimulus. So that's going to what it's going to do is it's going to activate a lot of neurons, nociceptors and touch receptors, and heat receptors in my hand. So there'll be a lot of sensation coming to the relay nerve, and the intensity of that stimulus, if it's high, the interneuron will override sending the signal directly to the brain first, and then we'll send a response as quickly as possible to the right parts of the body to respond to appropriately to that intense stimulus. All right. So reflexes are determined by the intensity of the incoming stimulus. This is not a conscious decision either. I don't have control over whether or not this happens if a reflex happens. So that's kind of the key thing about a reflex, is they're like inborn protective mechanisms that our spinal cord has. They're an adaptation. Right, so the reflex is it's an automatic response by the nervous system to an external stimulus. The brain does not coordinate the response. All right, so that's key. So instead, the sensory neurons work together with the motor neurons to create a response. The interneuron in the spinal cord receives the message from sensory neurons and decides if a reflex response is appropriate. So it's an evolutionary adaptation to prevent bodily harm. So if we can move quickly without having to use decision-making processes, we can remove ourselves from a threatening situation faster. Messages are sent to the brain in a reflex, but the messages reach the brain after the reflex has already been elicited. So once the brain receives the message, the reflex reaction has already been carried out because it's a bit slower. So that after a reflex, what we do with the interpretation in the brain is we start to feel that pain and we elicit social responses. All right? So the brain coordinates responses to show pain, and we release hormones so the person feels pain in order to avoid use of an injured body part, or indicate to others that we're hurt or scared or threatened and we need help. So the social messaging of a reflex happens in the brain, but the actual carrying out of the reflex happens in the spinal cord. Okay? So the reflex is not under conscious control. The senses that we have to detect stimuluses, right? Sight, hearing, smell, taste, they're all concentrated in one spot. Touch, which will feel temperature and pain and sensation, that's found throughout our skin. So this is interesting. If you look at page 151 of your textbook, this shows a normal body, and this shows a body if it was in proportionate to the amount of touch receptors that exist. So you can see we have a lot of touch sensation in our hands, and in our feet, and in our face, right? So if the body was actually proportionate to the amount of touch receptors that were present, our body would look like this. And that would be a not very functional body, obviously. Okay, so that's the nervous system. We have one more lecture in this unit, actually, and it's going to be based on disease. So I'll do that in another lesson. This is fair game for a test. We're getting to the nitty-gritty of this unit. We'll talk to you later, guys. Have a good one.